have a really quick mini tutorial for you today. A few of you have asked to see how I make self-covered buttons, so I thought I'd show you the 3 different methods that I use. Let's get started. Okay, so the first method I'm going to show you is the sewing method, and that's using these prim buttons or button blanks. These are the 11mm ones. I much prefer these to the hemline equivalent. I do think that the backing option that these ones come with is much better and easier to use than the hemline equivalent, so I always recommend these prim ones over anything else that I've found. You'll see here that the back of the packet also has the template that you need for your fabric, so you need to remove your button blanks really carefully. They are quite stiff because obviously they don't want you to lose any of the pieces before you've got them home, so you do need to be a little bit kind of forceful to get the back off, but you obviously don't want to damage the template either, so I like to kind of use my tweezers and ease the backing off. But you also want to make sure that it doesn't ping off and you lose it completely. So I've got the back off and then I've got the front there, so you want to make sure that you keep both of those pieces very safe and secure. Don't lose any of them. Ask me how I know. And I'm going to remove these other 2 buttons from the card, hopefully carefully. Okay, so now that I have got all of the button blanks off of my piece of card with only the smallest of war wounds, I am now going to cut out the template that comes with the card. So I have my template, and this also has the instructions of how to make your buttons. So you want to be quite accurate with your template. If it's too small, then you won't have enough fabric to go around the button blank. If it's too big, there'll be too much bulk for the back to be securely pressed on to the button blank. So the next thing I need to do is take my template and my fabric and draw around my fabric. Now I'm using this viscose and I have cut this out on the bias here for piping, but I'm just double checking to see how fray prone this fabric is. And this is an edge that's been hanging around for ages, but like me pulling on this bias cut edge and this raw edge here, it's not falling apart. I have used a looser weave viscose in the past, and I found that if I wasn't careful, my stitches could actually just pull the piece of fabric to pieces. When I found that was the case, I applied some really lightweight interfacing. So this is super lightweight interfacing. I get this from Australia. I will link to it in the description down below. If you have a fabric that does fray super easily, I would highly recommend that you interface the entirety of the piece of fabric before you start drawing and cutting out your button template. But this fabric is behaving itself. It's nice and tightly woven. I don't think I need to interface this one. I need 13 buttons in total. Not that I will make every single one of those today with you, but I do need 13. So I'm going to put my template on my fabric, and I'm using a friction pen, and I'm just going to go around and trace around my template. And I'm actually going to do that 14 or 15 times. This is an irreplaceable fabric. I haven't got any more than these scraps here. I want to make myself a couple of extra spare buttons for my project in case I lose one or one gets damaged, or in case something goes wrong in the making process. Ask me how I know. So I'm going to trace out about 14 or 15 of these templates. Okay, so I've got all of my templates traced out, and now I'm going to cut them out. I have my piece cut out, and now I need a thread and needle. Not too much thread because you don't want anything too kind of unwieldy. So we are going to be doing a running stitch or a gathering stitch all the way around the edge of the fabric, and you want to backstitch at the start of this so that you can pull on this. Don't just think that you'll be able to leave yourself a long tail and hold on to the tail and pull on both sides, because believe me, that won't work. Ask me how I know. Now you want to be going quite close to the edge because you obviously don't want any of these stitches showing on your final button, but we are just doing a gathering stitch all the way around the edge of the fabric. Now this fabric, as I showed you, doesn't actually fray. If your fabric is very fray prone, these stitches can actually just pull the small piece that you've got to pieces. Again, ask me how I know. So that's when you want the interfacing, but it really does have to be a lightweight interfacing, because otherwise you'll end up with far too much bulk and it won't gather nicely. So if you're not sure, experiment with little bits and pieces before you kind of go for your finished combination. So it's not the most beautiful stitching you've ever seen in your life, but it is just a running gather stitch. So now that I've got everything gathered, I'm going to take my button blank, and we've got the front of the button there, which is the piece that we're going to cover, and then this is the piece that's going to secure everything into place. So you want to take your button front, the bit with the shank on it, and you're going to place that in the center of your circle that you've just run your gathering stitches around, and you're going to pull on your gathering stitches. And this is so teeny tiny and fiddly that I'm having to cover a lot of it up to actually be able to do this. But if you pull on your gathering stitches, you should end up with the fabric completely covering the outside of your button. And because you have sewn that anchoring stitch in to begin with, you should be able to pull fairly kind of tautly on those stitches. So you should end up with something that looks like this. So you're going to take the back of your button, and as you can see, it's kind of like a cone shape, like this. And so when you get your packet of buttons, the cone this is the wrong way. This is facing out the wrong way, because if they put it in the other way, then the buttons would seal together. So they obviously have to package it so that you can get them apart. This also has like little teeth in it, if you can see there. So what you want to do is you're going to take the back of your button, and you are going to one-handedly, you're going to fit that over the shank. So this hole of this button back fits over the shank of your button front, and you will need 2 hands to do this, but that is what you're aiming for, so that you've got the teeth going into all of the fabric, and it doesn't look like it's going to fit, but it will. So once you've got your back in position, you need to squish everything together so that it's biting into the fabric and holding onto everything. I've got these pliers that I've got with my corset making kit, and they do have teeth on them, so I am going to wrap the button in another piece of fabric so that it doesn't damage the actual fabric that's going to be on the front of the button. And you want to squeeze the front and the back together without breaking anything. So this again is not the easiest of things to do. You want to go around and squeeze and make sure that the back has snapped into place, which this one now has. So I now have a finished button. Let me show you what that looks like a little closer up. So here we have our finished teeny tiny button. As you can see, that back has been pushed into and gripped under the ridge of the outer part of the button. So now all of the fabric is squished in here, and also you will be able to see that you can see through the shank of the button, so you'll be able to sew this button onto your project through that hole. So I now need to repeat that 14 more times. Wish me luck. This is my favourite kind of self-covered button to make because I think it's the easiest one. I got this little self-covered button device from Prim. I will link it in the description down below. I had a couple of them because they are very easily dented, especially if you get the backing in the wrong way around. Ask me how I know. But I would highly recommend these, so I have replaced this when it has broken. You don't necessarily have to use Prim blanks with this little device. I got these from my local fabric shop. So as long as the size of the button blank you're using corresponds with one of the sizes on the back of this device here, and you can see they're all printed on there. As long as the size of the button blank is the same as one of these measurements, then you can use this device. You also need your button blank back to have a ridge in it. The fronts usually always have some kind of teeth on them. The ridge on the button back is what fits into this part of the press and allows you to squeeze the button together. There are a few requirements for using this little device, but I highly recommend it. And obviously you can buy blanks from the company that make this that go with this, but I found that it does work with other button blanks as well. So these blanks fit into the 29mm press. So when you get this device, it comes with a piece of card that has all of the diameters of the different types of buttons that you can use with it. So you can want to cut this out as a template. Something I do recommend is cutting out the largest size so that you have that, because obviously if you cut out the smaller ones then you don't have the bigger sizes anymore. And once you've got the largest size cut out, I would suggest that you go through and make yourself templates of the smaller sizes. And I also like to make the templates out of see-through things so you can actually fussy cut your buttons out, which I'll show you in a second. I'm going to start off today with the 29mm buttons. The template for these is actually quite large, and you do want to make sure that your machine will sew this size of buttonhole. Ask me how I know. Mine does, but you do have to do it manually. It won't do it automatically, which is fine, just a little bit of a pain. So I have this newsprint cap fabric here, and I'm just going to go for the actual newsprint itself because, I mean, I could, do you know what, actually? I'm going to fussy cut it and I'm going to go for this guy. Now, I haven't got a see-through. This is why you want a see-through template, because you want to be able to position the template over the piece that you want to fussy cut, and that means that I really need to kind of center. Now, is he going to fit? Only his little nose is going to fit. I still think that's going to look cute. We'll give it a try. So you want to place your template over the piece that you want to cut out and draw around it. Take it off. If you're happy with the placement, which I think I am, you're going to cut that out. So I have my fabric, I have my button front, and I have my button back. Just double check which spot it's going into, and it's this one. And you want to put your fabric in, and you want to put the button blank on to the wrong side of the fabric, centering the blank as much as possible. And then you want to press that button blank into the mold, and there's going to be a lot of excess fabric poking out over the top, so you want to kind of like tuck that all in and under. That's where I really like my purple fang. Again, I'll link that in the description down below. So I'm then going to put my button back on, and you want to make sure that you've got the button back on in the right direction. So there's the ridge that this part of the device is going to go into. This side is the wrong side, so you want to make sure that you're putting it right way in, because you will damage your pressing device. Ask me how I know. And obviously the shank of the button needs to go through the little hole that's in the button back here. And so once you're happy that you've got everything in place and that you've got your fabric all tucked in, and again, that's where this comes in really helpful. There's no sewing in this one, as you've noticed. You're going to take this and you're going to put it into the groove on the back of your button. I do find this is easier if I stand up, and you're going to push. You should hear a click like you did there, and that means that the button back is in the button front and has sandwiched your fabric. So technically we have a finished button here. I can't wait to see what kind of angry cat face we have on this one. I'm going to push it out, and we do have the best angry cat face ever. I think that's absolutely awesome. So fussy cutting your buttons is definitely an option. Something I will say, if you have a particular motif that needs to be the right way up like this cat, is when you are pressing the button, you want to make sure that you're getting the shank of the button in the same orientation that you want to sew the cat on. If I sew this one on with a regular stitch that doesn't take into account the orientation of the button, the cat's going to be looking at you squiffy, which not the end of the world, I don't think. And to be honest, I'm not sure I'm ever going to sew this onto anything, because I think I might just keep him to judge me in the corner. But it is something to bear in mind that if you have a pattern or a print like this that does need to be in a particular orientation, you want to make sure that when you put the blank in, that the shank is in the correct orientation for the print. So fussy cutting your buttons is definitely an option, but it's not one that you have to go for. All of these buttons here are created in the same manner, obviously with different sizes, but from one piece of fabric, and because there was a really large overall print, I've ended up with some very different looking buttons. I really like how this looks on dresses. I think it is an attractive feature, but you can fussy cut out an entire set of buttons from fabric if you're willing to space out the circles that you're cutting out of your starting fabric that much, and you really want to have specific items featured. Then you can make some very, very cute buttons like that kitty cat. That is cute. One last method I have is if you have a very thick fabric like this wool that I used to make my red coat, this one actually would not get squished in between the teeth and the back of this button. Also, I wanted to use this absolutely ginormous button which did not fit into any of the sizes of the mold that I've got here. So I had to do something a little bit different with this button. Now, the button blank itself does have the shank on it, so I ignored the button back and put that away, and I just used the front. Now, I don't have a template for the size of fabric that you need to cut out for this one, but you saw how big the piece of fabric was for the last button that we did, so I'm going to guesstimate and go for quite a large circle, which is probably actually not remotely circular, but it's a fairly good shape. And it's better to go too big than too small because you want to make sure that you have enough fabric to really cover the entirety of the button and that none of it is going to escape. I'm going to cut out my rather square-ish circle. I actually didn't make a spare for my coat, so I'm kind of glad that I'm doing this because this will mean that I do have a spare. Okay, so now that I've cut that out, and if I fold that all in, I think it might actually be, it's going to be just that little bit too large, so I am going to trim this down just a little bit. But before I do that, I'm going to grab my thread, and I am using hot pink because it's what I have to hand, but it's never going to get seen, so it's not the end of the world. So I actually want a slightly longer piece of thread this time because I want to double this up, because this is going to be holding everything into place. So I want to make sure it's nice and firm. If I can thread my needle, not with these glasses on. So I'm going to trim this down just a little bit. So I've just taken a tiny little bit off of my circle, or circle-ish. And if you have a look online, I'm sure there is probably a template for this button size, and if I can find it, I will link it in the description down below. I need to do the same thing that we did for the very first button. And is there a right and a wrong side of this wool? Yeah, that's the right side. So we're going to sew gathering stitches all the way around the outside of our circle, and I am going to backstitch at the start because I want to hold everything in place. I'm using my thread doubled up because I want this to be super strong, because it is a very thick fabric that we are going to be trying to densely gather in a second. So I'm just going to sew gathering stitches all the way around my circle. So I've sewn all the way around my circle, and I have actually gone over the anchoring stitches that I started with, just so that I don't have an area that won't gather right here. Obviously the next thing we're going to do is put our button blank in and pull on our gathering stitches. And you want to be somewhat careful with this because this is a very dense fabric. So we're going to work. The teeth are trying to eat me. I'm going to work our gathering all the way around. Okay, so put my button blank in, and again I want to center this, and then we are going to pull, and hopefully my threads won't break this time. That would be nice. Got a little bit at the end that's just not gathering, so work those stitches around by hand if you need to. Joys of thick fabrics. There we go. Everything is going in quite nicely. A little bit of steam, if you're careful and mind your fingers, will help this, especially with a wool fabric like this. I have used this method for my velvet buttons as well on my velvet coat. So you just want to rearrange the fabric and push, and again carefully pull on your thread because you really don't want to break this thread. So once you're happy with everything, we are then going to do some sewing, and you basically want to pass the thread through as many of the gathers as you can, and this is going to be tricky but doable. So you just want to keep tension on the thread, and eventually, because you're stitching around and around and around, and I'm literally just stitching through those gathers, but as you're stitching around and around, it will all start to kind of tense up and you're stitching it into place basically, so it will start to stay in place. This is definitely the time that if you use a thimble, you want a thimble. It's definitely awkward, but it is totally doable. So again, pulling on that thread, making sure everything is staying in place. Curved needle might help in this instance as well. But you want to keep stitching and you want to go around a couple of times because you really want to make sure that this is really taut and really, really secure and in place. And you'll notice that you can still see the shank of the button in here, so it's still usable and so honourable to the coat. That's something that is important. You want to make sure that your fabric is not covering up the shank of your button, because otherwise you can still sew it to the coat in a variety of ways, and I use these as decorative buttons on my red coat. Finish closure method on my red coat is press studs, large press studs, which I quite like. I know not everybody does, but I do. My buttons really are decorative, and you may wish to just sew these on around the outside edge to finish off your coat. So I've gone around once and I'm just going to go around a couple of more times. So once you are happy that everything is being held in place, you just want to finish off your stitching with a couple of back stitches and knots, and cut your thread. And there you have a finished button. It's definitely not the most beautiful thing that you have ever seen on the underside, but the right side of the button is the same as the fabric on my coat or whatever thick project you are working on, and the shank is still available for you to sew the button on so that you can use the button as you regularly would. Or if you want to do the same thing that I did, I actually put this in place and then sewed the button on all the way around so that it was flush to the coat, because I knew it was covering up the divots that the press studs were making in the outer garment. So I put this over the press stud placement and sewed it down all around this edge, which I used a curved needle for, and that finished it off nicely. But that is a way of doing a covered button with a thick fabric that there is absolutely no way that the back of this button and the teeth that are in the metal button would have gone through all of these layers of fabric and held this in place. That would have pinged off and I ended up with fabric going everywhere. My absolute favourite is the little hand press tool. I think that's absolutely brilliant. I haven't actually tried making any of the teeny tiniest, smallest buttons that are available in that hand press tool. I can imagine trying to do it without any sewing would be incredibly difficult and frustrating. I can imagine that you would definitely want to gather the fabric and sew it together so that it didn't move whilst you were putting the button into the press and actually finishing off the button. But for the bigger sizes, you don't need to do any sewing, which is awesome and kind of why I like it. If you don't want to do any kind of sewing at all, you can always find your local button maker. I absolutely love Harlequin. As you guys know, I've had lots of self-covered belts made by them in the past, but they also do self-covered buttons, and they do a variety of different styles, shapes, and even some fancy ones as well, which I would like to treat myself to at some point. But all of the options that I've shown you are relatively easy to do at home and will give you lovely results, even if they are just that little bit fiddly. If you've enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this one here.